In October of 1842, in the pastoral hamlet of Willowbrook, Massachusetts, groundskeeper Thomas Hartley made a discovery that would shatter the genteel facade of New England society forever. While preparing to plant new apple trees in the orchard behind the prestigious Whitmore Academy for Young Ladies, his spade struck something that shouldn't have been there: a small skull, no larger than a china teacup. By sunset, 7 more had been unearthed. 8 children in total, aged between 4 and 11 years, their remains arranged in neat rows beneath the gnarled roots of trees that had been feeding on them for nearly a decade. Each small skeleton was found wrapped in the same distinctive blue wool fabric used for the Academy's winter cloaks, and each bore signs of prolonged illness before death, illness that the beloved governess, Miss Abigail Turner, had dutifully reported to parents as consumption or brain fever. The records of what happened next were sealed by order of Judge Cornelius Whitmore, the Academy founder's own brother, and buried in the Massachusetts State Archives for 181 years. They might have remained hidden forever, if not for a water pipe burst in the archive's basement last spring that exposed a collection of documents marked "Never to be opened" by order of the Commonwealth. But here's what should truly disturb you. Miss Turner didn't just kill these children. She had been specifically hired to do so. Before we continue with Miss Turner's methodical elimination of unsuitable children from prominent families, if this story intrigues you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're about to uncover one of America's most deliberately hidden historical horrors, and you won't want to miss a single revelation. I want to know. Tell us in the comments what state or city you're from. Are there any dark historical secrets buried in your hometown's past? Only the bravest viewers, the true mystery seekers among you, will make it through what I'm about to reveal. Because what happened at Willowbrook Academy wasn't just murder. It was a systematic operation that reached into the highest levels of Massachusetts society. Are you ready to learn why 8 families paid to have their own children disappear? Please type continue to proceed to part 3. Willowbrook, Massachusetts in 1842 was the epitome of New England prosperity. With a population of 3,847 souls, it sat 30 miles west of Boston, perfectly positioned along the Merrimack River to benefit from both the textile mill boom and the agricultural abundance of the Connecticut River Valley. The town boasted 2 churches, Congregational and Episcopal, a library that rivaled Boston's in its collection of European volumes, and most importantly, the Whitmore Academy for Young Ladies. The academy had been established in 1831 by industrialist Jeremiah Whitmore, who made his fortune in the Lowell mills before deciding that New England needed an institution to rival the finishing schools of Philadelphia and New York. By 1842, Willowbrook had transformed from a sleepy farming community into a destination for the region's elite. Wealthy families from Boston, Providence, and even New York sent their daughters here, drawn by the Academy's promise to cultivate roses from even the roughest soil. The social structure was rigid and unforgiving. At the top sat the mill owners and shipping magnates, their wives hosting elaborate teas while their husbands negotiated contracts that would determine the fate of hundreds of immigrant workers. Below them, the merchant class struggled to maintain respectability, desperately seeking advantageous marriages for their children. And at the bottom, invisible to polite society, were the Irish workers who had begun flooding into Massachusetts following the economic collapse in their homeland. Miss Abigail Turner arrived in this carefully ordered world in the spring of 1833, carrying impeccable references from the Browning School in London, and a letter of introduction from no less than the Archbishop of Canterbury himself. At 28, she was unmarried but not yet firmly labeled a spinster. Tall, auburn-haired, with what one contemporary account described as eyes of such pale gray they seem to look through you rather than at you. The delay in discovering her crimes can be attributed to three factors that would prove fatal for 8 children. First, childhood mortality in the 1840s was devastatingly common. Scarlet fever, whooping cough, and consumption claimed 1 in 5 children before their 12th birthday. Second, the isolation of the academy, set on 40 acres of pristine woodland, meant that few outside observers ever witnessed daily life within its walls. And third, most crucially, the parents who sent their difficult children to Miss Turner's special care knew exactly what they were paying for. You see, Willowbrook Academy served two purposes. Publicly, it was a prestigious finishing school for young ladies of good breeding. But privately, certain wealthy families had discovered it offered another service entirely, a permanent solution to the problem of children who threatened their social standing. To understand how Miss Turner operated for nearly a decade without suspicion, we must first understand the woman the community thought they knew. Every Sunday, she sat in the third pew of the Congregational Church, her charges arranged around her like perfectly dressed dolls. She contributed thoughtful essays to the Ladies' Moral Society newsletter on topics such as the cultivation of obedience in the young and the dangers of excessive imagination in female children. Dr. Elias Morton, Willowbrook's most respected physician, would later testify that he had never met a woman more devoted to the welfare of children. She consulted him frequently about her charge's health, keeping detailed medical records that would have impressed any modern physician. When little Catherine Ashford developed a persistent cough in the winter of 1839, Miss Turner spent 3 nights by her bedside, administering Dr. Morton's prescribed treatments with what he described as the devotion of a mother. The townspeople saw her at Brennan's General Store every Tuesday, purchasing peppermint sticks and hair ribbons for her special students, those girls who boarded at the academy year-round rather than returning home for holidays. Mrs. Brennan would later recall how Miss Turner always knew each girl's favorite treat, how she remembered their birthdays, how she spoke of them with such fondness that you'd think they were her own daughters. But there were signs, dismissed or explained away by a community that couldn't conceive of such evil wearing such a respectable face. The Academy's head groundskeeper, Patrick O'Brien, mentioned to his wife that Miss Turner insisted on tending certain parts of the orchard herself, refusing his help even when she emerged with dirt under her fingernails and her dress hem muddy. English ladies and their gardening, his wife had laughed. There was the curious fact that Miss Turner's special students were never visited by their families. When Mrs. Alina Prescott inquired about the Ashford girls' parents at a church social, Miss Turner explained with practiced sorrow that poor Catherine's family situation is quite delicate. Her father's business failings, you understand. They prefer their daughter to receive charity quietly. Everyone nodded sympathetically and asked no more questions. The warning signs accumulated like snow before an avalanche. The unusually high turnover of academy servants, who left citing unnatural feelings about the special dormitory. The fact that Miss Turner personally prepared all meals for her special students, claiming they required specific diets for their various ailments. The letters she wrote to parents on behalf of children too ill to hold a pen, always in the same careful script, always saying the same reassuring things. Sheriff William Donnelly would later discover that Miss Turner had cultivated 3 essential enablers, though none knew the full truth. Dr. Morton provided medical legitimacy, signing death certificates without viewing bodies, trusting Miss Turner's detailed descriptions of final symptoms. Reverend James Whitfield performed quiet burial services for children whose families wished to avoid the spectacle of public grief. and Judge Cornelius Whitmore ensured that any questions about the academy were quickly silenced, protecting his brother's investment and unknowingly enabling a monster. The unraveling began with Margaret Bellwether, age 9, who arrived at Whitmore Academy in September of 1842. Unlike the other special students, Margaret possessed an unfortunate combination of intelligence and stubbornness that would prove to be Miss Turner's undoing. She had been sent to the academy by her father, a Boston banker who had discovered that Margaret was not, in fact, his biological daughter, a secret that would have destroyed his political ambitions if revealed. Margaret noticed things the other girls didn't. She noticed that the medicine Miss Turner gave the special students each evening made them drowsy and confused. She noticed that Lucy Harrington, who had been sent home to recover in August, had left behind all her belongings, including the locket from her dead mother that she never removed. Most importantly, Margaret noticed the peculiar smell that clung to Miss Turner's clothing after her late-night visits to the orchard, a smell like spoiled meat mixed with lye soap. On October 3rd, 1842, Margaret feigned sleep and followed Miss Turner into the night. Hidden behind the garden shed, she watched the governess drag something wrapped in blue wool across the frost-covered ground. The bundle was small, no bigger than Margaret herself, and it left dark streaks in the moonlit grass. Margaret would later tell investigators that she knew, with the horrible certainty children possess, that she was watching Miss Turner bury her friend Emma Thornfield, who had supposedly been collected by her aunt just that morning. The second incident occurred 8 days later. Thomas Hartley, the groundskeeper, had been troubled by his employer's strict instructions to avoid the old section of the orchard. But October's early frost had damaged several trees, and his professional pride overcame his deference. While assessing the damage on October 11th, he discovered that the earth beneath several trees had recently been disturbed. More disturbing still, the apple trees in this section grew with unusual vigor, their fruit larger but somehow wrong, too red, too sweet, with flesh that seemed almost meat-like in texture. Hartley might have dismissed his concerns if not for what happened that very evening. He encountered young Margaret Bellwether attempting to escape through the academy's back gate, her nightgown torn and her feet bloody from running barefoot across the gravel. "She's poisoning us," the girl gasped. "She puts things in our food. Emma's dead, Lucy's dead, they're all dead, and she's going to kill me next." The third and final discovery came from an unexpected source, Dr. Morton himself. On October 14th, he was called to examine Margaret, whom Miss Turner claimed had suffered a hysterical episode brought on by excessive imagination. But Morton found the girl lucid, specific in her accusations, and most troublingly, showing symptoms of chronic arsenic exposure. The telltale white lines across her fingernails, the patches of darkened skin, the persistent tremor in her hands. That evening, Dr. Morton did something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He returned to his office and reviewed 9 years of death certificates he had signed for Miss Turner's special students. The pattern emerged like a photograph in a developing solution. Always the same progression of symptoms, always the same timeline from first illness to death, always occurring during school breaks when the regular students were away. The discovery scene itself would be burned into Willowbrook's collective memory. On the morning of October 15th, Sheriff Donnelly, Dr. Morton, and Thomas Hartley began excavating the orchard. The first body was found 3 feet down, wrapped in blue wool that had partially preserved it in the clay-rich soil. It was Emma Thornfield, aged 7, her blonde hair still in the braids Miss Turner had plaited 4 weeks earlier. By noon, they had found 3 more. By evening, 8 small bodies lay in the tool shed, awaiting proper identification. Dr. Morton's field examination revealed that each child showed signs of systematic poisoning over a period of weeks or months. arsenic primarily, but also mercury, and in 2 cases, concentrated foxglove. The doses had been carefully calibrated, enough to cause increasing illness that mimicked natural disease, but not enough to raise immediate suspicion. Sheriff Donnelly found Miss Turner in her study, calmly burning papers in the fireplace. When informed that the bodies had been discovered, she merely nodded and said, "I suppose you'll be wanting my records, then. There in the bottom drawer, I've kept everything quite meticulously." The records she hadn't managed to burn were indeed meticulous. Each child's treatment was documented in a leather-bound journal with the precision of a scientific experiment. Dates of arrival, payments received, substances administered, symptoms observed, and finally, the clinical notation. Contract fulfilled. If this is giving you chills, you're not alone. When I first discovered these documents in the Massachusetts archives, I had to stop reading several times. What we're about to uncover next goes beyond simple murder. It reveals a network of wealthy families who viewed their own children as disposable embarrassments. Please hit that like button if you want more people to know this hidden history, and share this video with anyone interested in true crime and historical mysteries. Let's discover together what happens when investigators began following the money trail, because what they found implicated some of New England's most prominent families, names you would definitely recognize today. The horror is about to get so much worse. The physical evidence found in Miss Turner's study painted a picture of systematic evil that defied comprehension. Her primary journal, bound in black leather with gold-embossed edges, contained 127 pages of detailed entries spanning from May 1833 to October 1842. Each child was assigned a case number, never referred to by name after the initial entry. Case 1, Sarah Whitfield, aged 6, had been the daughter of a prominent minister who suffered from what we would now recognize as autism. Her father had paid £500, a fortune in 1833, for Miss Turner to resolve the family's burden. The journal revealed Miss Turner's methodology with chilling precision. She had developed what she called the 3-stage protocol. Stage 1 involved gaining the child's trust through kindness and special attention, usually lasting 2 to 3 weeks. During this period, she would begin introducing small amounts of arsenic into their food, causing mild stomach distress that she would then tenderly nurse. Stage 2 escalated the poisoning while maintaining the facade of devoted care, writing concerned letters to parents about the child's declining condition. Stage 3, typically lasting no more than a week, involved concentrated doses that induced final organ failure, timed to coincide with school holidays when witnesses were minimal. Dr. Morton's subsequent medical examination of the remains revealed horrors beyond the poisoning. 4 of the children showed evidence of laudanum administration in their final days, enough to keep them docile but conscious. Tiny Margaret Thornfield, only 4 years old, had defensive wounds on her hands, suggesting she had fought despite the drugs. The positioning of the bodies indicated they had been buried while still warm, some perhaps not entirely deceased. But it was the financial records that revealed the true scope of the operation. Miss Turner had maintained a separate ledger, disguised as a household expense book, that detailed her special arrangement fees. Over 9 years, she had received payments totaling £8,000, equivalent to nearly $400,000 in today's currency. The payments came through various channels: false charity donations, inflated tuition fees, and in 3 cases, direct bank transfers from accounts in London. The client list read like a who's who of New England society. Judge Cornelius Whitmore himself had paid for the disposal of his illegitimate daughter. The Ashford family had eliminated their eldest son, who had been born with a cleft palate and clubfoot. The Harringtons had rid themselves of twins who showed signs of their grandmother's madness. Each family had been seeking the same service: the discreet disappearance of children who threatened their social standing, inheritance structures, or political ambitions. Miss Turner's correspondence, recovered from a hidden compartment in her desk, revealed an even darker truth. She was not operating alone, but was part of a network that stretched across the Atlantic. Letters from a Dr. Blackwood in London discussed similar arrangements at schools in Birmingham and Manchester. A coded message from Paris mentioned Notter system being implemented in 3 French boarding schools. Miss Turner, it seemed, was part of an international conspiracy that viewed itself as providing a necessary service to society's elite. The most disturbing document was a philosophical treatise Miss Turner had written but never sent, titled On the Necessity of Selective Cultivation in Human Society. In it, she argued that just as gardeners must prune diseased branches to save the tree, society must remove defective offspring to preserve the strength of noble bloodlines. She wrote, "We do not murder. We merely accelerate nature's inevitable judgment. These children, marked by God with their various afflictions, would suffer greatly in a world that has no place for them. We offer mercy disguised as education, peace disguised as medicine." Testimony from surviving students revealed the terror that pervaded the special dormitory. Elizabeth Crane, who had shared a room with Lucy Harrington, described how Lucy would cry every night, begging to go home, only to be told by Miss Turner that, "Your parents don't want you anymore. I'm the only one who cares for you now." The regular students had been instructed never to interact with the special girls, told they suffered from contagious conditions that required isolation. The groundskeeper, Patrick O'Brien, when pressed, admitted he had suspected something was wrong. He described finding Miss Turner in the orchard one night in 1839, kneeling beside a freshly planted apple tree, whispering what sounded like a prayer. When he approached, she looked up with tears streaming down her face and said, "They grow so beautifully here, don't they? Fed by innocence." He had thought she meant the trees. The investigation revealed that Miss Turner had refined her techniques over the years. The earliest victims showed signs of crude poisoning, but the later ones displayed symptoms so closely mimicking natural disease that without Margaret Bellwether's testimony, they might never have been detected. She had studied medical texts, consulted unknowingly with Dr. Morton about dosages, and even conducted what appeared to be experiments on animals to perfect her methods. Sheriff Donnelly's team discovered a secondary burial site behind the Academy's ice house, containing the remains of 3 infants, children too young to be students, whose presence at the Academy was never officially recorded. These, investigators concluded, were likely the newborns of servants or fallen women, disposed of for a fee. The bones were too degraded to determine the cause of death, but their presence suggested Miss Turner's services extended beyond eliminating unwanted heirs. The investigation that followed would tear Willowbrook apart and send shockwaves through New England society. Sheriff Donnelly, a man of limited education but strong moral conviction, found himself confronting forces far beyond his small-town authority. Within days of the discovery, he received visits from 3 state senators, 2 federal judges, and a representative of the governor himself, all suggesting that the matter be handled quietly to avoid unnecessary scandal. The resistance came in many forms. Key witnesses suddenly developed memory problems. Documents disappeared from the courthouse. The editor of the Willowbrook Gazette received an anonymous note warning that his children attended a school where accidents could happen. When Donnelly persisted, he found his own mortgage called in by the bank, forcing him to borrow money from his brother-in-law to keep his home. But Donnelly had an unexpected ally in Jonathan Hartley, a young prosecutor from Boston who had recently lost his own daughter to scarlet fever. Hartley recognized that the Turner case represented something larger, a systematic corruption that reached into the highest levels of society. Together, they began following the financial trail, uncovering a web of connections that stretched from Boston to New York to London. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Miss Turner's personal maid, an Irish immigrant named Bridget O'Connor, who had fled to Connecticut after the arrests. When finally located and questioned, she revealed that Miss Turner had received regular visitors, always at night, always through the servants' entrance. These visitors included Dr. Blackwood from London, who had stayed at the academy for 3 weeks in 1840, observing Miss Turner's methods and taking copious notes. More disturbing still was the discovery of a second journal, hidden beneath floorboards in Miss Turner's bedroom. This journal contained correspondence with someone identified only as the architect, who appeared to be orchestrating similar operations across multiple countries. One letter, dated June 1841, read, "Your success rate exceeds all others in our enterprise. The Philadelphia branch has requested your protocols for implementation. Remember, we are gardeners of society, removing the weeds that would otherwise choke the flower of civilization." The investigation revealed that at least 3 other institutions in New England were operating similar schemes. The Blessed Angels Orphanage in Providence had experienced an unusual number of deaths among difficult children. The Fairmont School for Wayward Girls in Hartford had a cemetery that, when examined, contained far more graves than official records indicated. The St. Catherine's Home for Foundlings in Boston had been shipping children to adoptive families that didn't exist. Threats against the investigators escalated. Donnelly's deputy was attacked by unknown assailants and left with a broken arm and a message. "Stop digging or join them." Jonathan Hartley's office was burned, destroying months of carefully compiled evidence. Dr. Morton, who had agreed to testify, received a package containing a dead canary and a note. "Singing birds don't live long." The network fought back through legal channels as well. High-powered attorneys from Boston arrived to represent Miss Turner, arguing that no laws explicitly prohibited what she had done. After all, parents had legal authority over their children's medical care, and if they had consented to experimental treatments, what crime had been committed? They produced documents suggesting the children had died of natural causes despite Miss Turner's devoted care. The discovery of an international connection came through intercepted correspondence at the Boston Postal Office. Letters to Miss Turner from addresses in London, Paris, Berlin, and Vienna all used similar coded language discussing gardening, pruning, and cultivation. A letter from Berlin was particularly chilling. "The new scientific approaches to racial hygiene you describe align perfectly with our developing theories. Your practical work provides valuable data for our theoretical framework." Just when we thought we'd seen the depths of this horror, the international connections reveal something even more terrifying. Miss Turner wasn't just killing children. She was part of a movement that would later inspire some of history's darkest chapters. Please share this video before it's too late. These aren't just old stories. They're warnings about what happens when society decides some lives matter less than others. Our true crime family needs to know this history. Hit that share button now and help us expose the truth they tried to bury for almost 2 centuries. The trial of Abigail Turner began on March 13, 1843, in the Suffolk County Courthouse in Boston. The proceedings had been moved from Willowbrook after threats against potential jurors made a fair trial impossible in the small town. What should have been a straightforward murder trial instead became a battleground over class, privilege, and the very definition of humanity. Miss Turner's defense team, led by the formidable Augustus Blackstone, Esquire, argued that their client suffered from a feminine hysteria brought on by her unnatural spinster state and her excessive exposure to the difficulties of child-rearing without the steadying influence of a husband. They presented her not as a monster, but as a misguided woman who genuinely believed she was providing mercy to children who would otherwise suffer lives of ridicule and isolation. The prosecution, however, had Margaret Bellwether. Now 10 years old, Margaret took the stand with a composure that stunned the courtroom. She described in detail the systematic poisoning, the fear that pervaded the special dormitory, and most damningly, a conversation she had overheard between Miss Turner and Dr. Blackwood where they discussed increasing the efficiency of the protocol and expanding operations to California. But the trial's most dramatic moment came when Miss Turner herself took the stand. Rather than claiming innocence or insanity, she delivered a 2-hour testimony that amounted to a philosophical defense of eugenics. She spoke eloquently of ancient Spartan practices, of farm animals bred for strength, of gardens that required weeding. "I stand accused of murder," she said, her pale gray eyes scanning the packed courtroom, "but I have merely hastened the inevitable. These children, malformed, mad, or bearing the seed of their parents' sins, would have lived lives of suffering. I gave them peace." The verdict, when it came, shocked everyone. Guilty of only 2 counts of murder in the first degree, not guilty on 6 counts due to insufficient evidence of malicious intent. The families who had paid for Miss Turner's services had used their influence to ensure that most of the evidence against her was ruled inadmissible. Letters disappeared, witnesses recanted, bank records were mysteriously destroyed in a fire. Miss Turner was sentenced to death by hanging, but the sentence would never be carried out. On May 15, 1843, 2 days before her scheduled execution, she was found dead in her cell. The official cause was listed as suicide by poisoning. She had somehow obtained a vial of the same arsenic she had used on her victims. However, the guard on duty that night was later seen purchasing a farm in Ohio with cash far exceeding his means. The broader network largely escaped justice. Dr. Blackwood had fled to the continent before he could be arrested. The architect was never identified. The other institutions under investigation suddenly had fires that destroyed their records or floods that made exhumation impossible. Of the 12 families identified as having paid for Miss Turner's services, only 2 faced any consequences: social ostracism that lasted barely a season before they were quietly readmitted to polite society. Judge Cornelius Whitmore resigned from the bench but retained his fortune and died peacefully in his bed 5 years later. His brother Jeremiah closed the Whitmore Academy, selling the land to developers who built homes over the unmarked graves of children whose bodies were never found. The apple orchard was cut down, but residents reported that nothing would grow properly on that land for decades. The impact on the survivors was profound and lasting. Margaret Bellwether was returned to her father, who, fearing scandal, placed her in a convent. She would later escape, make her way to California, and become one of the state's first female doctors, dedicating her life to treating children whose families couldn't afford medical care. In her memoirs, published posthumously in 1898, she wrote, "I survived Miss Turner's poison, but I never recovered from the knowledge that my own father had paid for my death. The other students from the academy were scattered to the winds, their families eager to distance themselves from the scandal." Elizabeth Crane would later testify before a congressional committee investigating child welfare, saying, "We were taught that some children simply disappeared, and we were taught not to ask questions. That silence was our crime." Dr. Morton, haunted by his unwitting role in the murders, abandoned his practice and became an advocate for medical reform. pushing for stricter oversight of death certificates and mandatory autopsies for children who died in institutions. He spent his remaining years trying to atone, but in his final letter wrote, "I signed those death certificates without looking at those children's bodies. My professional pride and social deference made me an accomplice to murder." Sheriff Donnelly, despite pressure to remain silent, compiled a comprehensive report of his investigation. When no American publisher would touch it, he sent it to a small press in Montreal. Only 50 copies were printed before the plates were destroyed in another suspicious fire. Today, only 3 copies are known to exist: one in the Massachusetts archives, one in the British Library, and one in a private collection whose owner refuses to be identified. The reforms that followed were minimal and quickly undermined. A law requiring inspection of private boarding schools was passed but never funded. A registry of childhood deaths in institutions was created but abandoned after 3 years. The wealthy families who had participated in the scheme used their influence to ensure that the lessons of Willowbrook were buried along with the children in that orchard. Perhaps most disturbingly, correspondence discovered in the 1960s during renovation of a Boston building revealed that the network hadn't ended with Miss Turner's death. A letter dated 1855 discussed resuming the project with greater discretion and mentioned operations in San Francisco, New Orleans, and Chicago. The letter was signed "The New Architect" and contained a chilling postscript. "Turner's mistake was keeping records. We shall not repeat it." The case of Abigail Turner and the Willowbrook murders reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and the dangers of unchecked privilege. It demonstrates how easily a society can rationalize evil when it wears the mask of respectability and speaks the language of progress. The parents who paid Miss Turner weren't monsters in their own minds. They were practical people solving an inconvenient problem. What's most disturbing is how the concept of defective children, which seemed so abhorrent when revealed in 1842, would resurface repeatedly in American history. The eugenics movement of the early 20th century, the forced sterilizations that continued into the 1970s, the institutions where difficult children simply disappeared, all echo Miss Turner's philosophy that some lives are worth less than others. The story was hidden for so long because it implicated not just one woman, but an entire social structure. The families involved went on to found banks, universities, and hospitals that still bear their names today. 3 U.S. senators, 2 Supreme Court justices, and at least 1 president descended from families who had utilized Miss Turner's services. The truth was buried because exposing it would have meant acknowledging that American aristocracy was built, in part, on the graves of unwanted children. Modern DNA analysis of the remains, conducted quietly in 2019, revealed another layer to the horror. 3 of the children were actually the biological offspring of the men who had paid for their deaths, the products of affairs that threatened marriages and inheritances. The defects these children suffered from were nothing more than inconvenient existence. Why does this story matter now? Because the impulse that drove those parents to Miss Turner's door hasn't disappeared. It has simply taken new forms. When we decide that some children deserve fewer resources because of where they're born, when we look away from abuse because intervening would be inconvenient, when we allow systems to fail the most vulnerable because fixing them would cost too much, we are spiritual descendants of the Willowbrook parents. The 8 children whose bodies were found in that orchard had names, had dreams, had value. Sarah Whitfield loved to draw horses. Emma Thornfield could recite entire books from memory. Lucy Harrington sang so beautifully that even Miss Turner noted it in her journal, writing, "Such a waste of a lovely voice." They weren't defects to be eliminated. They were children who needed protection from the very people who should have loved them most. So I ask you, what do you really think happened in that orchard? Was Abigail Turner a lone monster, or was she simply the one who got caught? How many other Miss Turners operated in shadows, their crimes never discovered because they were more careful, more connected, or simply luckier? If this story disturbed you, good. It should. History's darkest chapters happen when good people choose comfort over conscience, when we decide that some injustices are too complicated to confront. The children of Willowbrook died because an entire community chose to look away. Thank you for your bravery in listening to this story. Subscribe to our channel if you want more hidden histories brought to light. Next week, we'll be exploring the mysterious disappearances at the Brendan Brook Sanatorium in 1921, another institution where society's inconvenient people simply vanished. Before you go, leave a comment. Do you think institutions like this could exist today? What warning signs would you look for? And remember, sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who convince us they're saviors. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and never stop asking questions about the stories they don't want you to know. Sheriff Donnelly, despite pressure to remain silent, compiled a comprehensive report of his investigation. When no American publisher would touch it, he sent it to a small press in Montreal. Only 50 copies were printed before the plates were destroyed in another suspicious fire. Today, only 3 copies are known to exist. One in the Massachusetts archives, one in the British Library, and one in a private collection whose owner refuses to be identified. The reforms that followed were minimal and quickly undermined. A law requiring inspection of private boarding schools was passed but never funded. A registry of childhood deaths in institutions was created but abandoned after 3 years. The wealthy families who had participated in the scheme used their influence to ensure that the lessons of Willowbrook were buried along with the children in that orchard. Perhaps most disturbingly, correspondence discovered in the 1960s during renovation of a Boston building revealed that the network hadn't ended with Miss Turner's death. A letter dated 1855 discussed resuming the project with greater discretion and mentioned operations in San Francisco, New Orleans, and Chicago. The letter was signed "The New Architect" and contained a chilling postscript. Turner's mistake was keeping records. We shall not repeat it. The case of Abigail Turner and the Willowbrook murders reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and the dangers of unchecked privilege. It demonstrates how easily a society can rationalize evil when it wears the mask of respectability and speaks the language of progress. The parents who paid Miss Turner weren't monsters in their own minds. They were practical people solving an inconvenient problem. What's most disturbing is how the concept of defective children, which seemed so abhorrent when revealed in 1842, would resurface repeatedly in American history. The eugenics movement of the early 20th century, the forced sterilizations that continued into the 1970s, the institutions where difficult children simply disappeared, all echo Miss Turner's philosophy that some lives are worth less than others. The story was hidden for so long because it implicated not just one woman, but an entire social structure. The families involved went on to found banks, universities, and hospitals that still bear their names today. 3 U.S. senators, 2 Supreme Court justices, and at least 1 president descended from families who had utilized Miss Turner's services. The truth was buried because exposing it would have meant acknowledging that American aristocracy was built, in part, on the graves of unwanted children. Modern DNA analysis of the remains, conducted quietly in 2019, revealed another layer to the horror. 3 of the children were actually the biological offspring of the men who had paid for their deaths. the products of affairs that threatened marriages and inheritances. The defects these children suffered from were nothing more than inconvenient existence. Why does this story matter now? Because the impulse that drove those parents to Miss Turner's door hasn't disappeared. It has simply taken new forms. When we decide that some children deserve fewer resources because of where they're born, when we look away from abuse because intervening would be inconvenient, when we allow systems to fail the most vulnerable because fixing them would cost too much, we are spiritual descendants of the Willowbrook parents. The 8 children whose bodies were found in that orchard had names, had dreams, had value. Sarah Whitfield loved to draw horses. Emma Thornfield could recite entire books from memory. Lucy Harrington sang so beautifully that even Miss Turner noted it in her journal, writing, "Such a waste of a lovely voice." They weren't defects to be eliminated. They were children who needed protection from the very people who should have loved them most. So I ask you, what do you really think happened in that orchard? Was Abigail Turner a lone monster, or was she simply the one who got caught? How many other Miss Turners operated in shadows, their crimes never discovered because they were more careful, more connected, or simply luckier? If this story disturbed you, good. It should. History's darkest chapters happen when good people choose comfort over conscience, when we decide that some injustices are too complicated to confront. The children of Willowbrook died because an entire community chose to look away. Thank you for your bravery in listening to this story. Subscribe to our channel if you want more hidden